It's very exciting to have you on for another episode. Cecily Milne, thank you for joining us on the Education Revolution.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, March 20, 2021, we had you on talking about the patience, presence, and intentional curiosity in the field of movement education. Serious title. And when I went back and listened to it the other day, it's very pedagogically focused. So we talked a lot about like your experiences in education as an individual when you were growing up and how that translated into how you were approaching teaching and learning in the movement industry with patience, presence, and intentional curiosity. Like these were kinds of pillars of your pedagogical practice and how you were teaching. I'd love to talk more about the evolution of your pedagogical practice, but today was something that a lot of people were interested in after that episode was the business side of things. So as an entrepreneur working in movement education, so like you have three big whammos in your world. You got working in a wellness industry. And I don't even know, like, do we even use that word anymore, Seth? I don't even know, wellness. Like, what does that even mean? But anyways, it comes with a whole loaded sense of things working in this industry. Two, you're working on teaching and learning, a lot of technology enhanced teaching and learning, which is like a huge fad and people are, thirsty for developing. And lastly, this entrepreneurial element. So you're, you've been an entrepreneur for a number of years and worked in a variety of elements, the yoga element before the Yoga Detour, and even writability, looking at copywriting before that for almost 6 years. So you're no stranger to entrepreneurialism, but there's this element of owning your own business in education, in the wellness industry, and also being a new mother. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about today. Says which thread you want to pull on first?
Well, what's coming to mind when you say all of that is an underlying theme that I think connects all of those different pieces, which is a never-ending need for pivotability. When you and I work together and develop the curriculum for what I call like our grad school program, Detour Method Synthesis, we looked at 5 elements of educational empowerment. And empowerment is one of those words that now is getting a bad rap as being like overused. But anyway, we'll just pin that. I'm still using it. One of the key elements of educational empowerment in that curriculum is responsive assessment, where we look at as educators how well we have the skill to go into a space and we already have some idea of what we want to do, assess what we see happening in front of us from our students and respond accordingly so that we don't let the plan be what dictates the class. We let the needs of our students be prioritized over the demands of our plan or the practice. So that's kind of like a micro example of what I really hold to be a macro practice in entrepreneurship in general. I have found over the past couple of years since we last spoke that I am likely a very difficult person to work with and for because I change my mind so much.
That's awesome.
I have spent a lot of money learning this lesson the hard way. For instance, paying web developers a very generous fee to build a website from scratch that I ended up hating because I did not have enough control over the ability to pivot. Whenever I have a new product in mind, whenever I want to change the language in a sales page, whenever I want to offer something as a one-off and temporary, how can I do that without having to pay somebody else to accommodate my every wish?
So this is like tangible takeaway number 1, which I'm sure I'm going to have, there'll be a laundry list of these throughout the next 45 minutes. Build light.
Build DIY has been my
light, build DIY. Some people who might not have, like, let's say some of us have comfort with a WordPress site. Some of us don't. Some of us want to use a Wix. Some of us don't. But if you need to have help, like if you're super not interested in doing that, even getting someone to help you do that. But ultimately part of that deal is they teach you, this is what I did. It's a really easy website. It's super light. If you want, when you want to change it, here's where you're going to go and do it. So if you do it yourself, you do it with somebody, build light, build for iteration.
There is nothing more frustrating for me and any other creative mind, I'm going to say, that when you have an idea that you wish to act on now, having to send that idea to somebody else and wait for them to get around to it. I would much prefer to have the skills within arm's reach to put my ideas into action as quickly as possible. As soon as I'm confident enough that it's real and happening and that, yes, this is the direction we're going in, we're going to go. So I walked away from my big custom built website. I built a Squarespace site, and the drag and drop options were just fine, because as I think we're all starting to realize, attention spans are nothing. People do not spend a lot of time on your website. Having a website may still feel necessary, but it's really just one piece of a much larger virtual ecosystem of how you identify yourself online. So we don't want to be hamstrung by these online outlets any more than what we already have to be by just having them in the first place.
Okay, I already have 2 other tangible tips. Tangible tip number 2 you just offered, which is diversify your voice across channels. So let's pull on that one for a minute. I'm going to pin the third one. I got to write it down so I don't forget it. There we go. That a website, while super important, and I think there's some elements here that we could also expand on if they're relevant to you. I mean, the way that you approach not only the way you approach your individual channel, so your website, your social media channels, we'll also talk about in your newsletter. The website and social media in particular, visual, very visually dynamic, and complementary. So there's a systemizing here, tangible tip, right? You diversify, you want to go in different channels, but there has to be synthesis. So can we talk a little bit about, because I want you to talk about how it's important to have all of these things in your fingertips and that you're driving a lot of this bus. And I know that that's the current reality, but we also have talked at length over the years about how it's important to free you up as an individual. So how do you get a common brand voice, that common brand voice that then can appear in diverse channels like a website, a newsletter, and a social media feed, for example? And you don't have to be the one doing everything. Like, do you feel like you do have to be the one doing everything?
Yeah, that's what I've learned. I don't think that when you're running a small business, we don't have the luxury of separating ourselves from our brand, which is unfortunate sometimes, because we can only do so much. We can only be so many places at the same time. So one of the ways in which I do leverage my voice and leverage my presence is by creating content that is out there working for me when I'm not working. So that is emails that get turned into blog posts that have decent SEO attached to them so that they're going to show up in Google searches, so that someone's reading my words and hearing my voice while I'm doing something else. Or we're sitting here today recording this podcast, and it's going to be listened to by other people in other places at other times, so that this version of me today continues to work for me out there once I've moved on and I'm doing other things. It's the same with the website. It's the same with social media. Everything that I'm posting on Instagram continues to live on and serve the purpose of my brand, but none of it can happen. None of it can exist without me putting in that work ahead of time up front. And that's what I think I've learned. I cannot divorce myself from that effort. When I have tried to do that, when I have tried to step back, the brand suffers. And so I am now aware that there is no removing me from my brand or my business identity.
And again, I think this is like connecting back to the fact that some of the first two threads, which is a wellness industry and an education focused products and services, right? So what you're saying right now is true for Yoga Detour as a brand. It might not be true if what you're doing is necessarily selling something else. But when you're working in wellness, health, movement, people want to see your body moving in certain ways. They want to hear you talking about what you know as a subject matter expert in the movement field. And then I'm an educator, right? So, I'm the teacher. If I'm working in the education space, it has to be my face. It can't be someone else, an actor I hire to teach my courses. It has to be me. So how much of that do you feel is the burden of the beast in which the industry and the products and services that you're working with?
Well, I've never worked in another industry, so I can't speak to how much that level of brand identity integration happens in other ways when it's like maybe a less aesthetic, like it's not all about how it looks when I'm doing the movement. Maybe if someone's an architect or they're doing something more work behind the scenes, then maybe their voice is less important to that than what my voice has been to this brand. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating. I'm sure that there are other brands out there where the people buying the product might be less invested in the creator behind that product. But that's not the case for me. And so what that's meant is that I have had to pivot and look at what I am willing to provide as that leader in the wellness space, as that educator. And I've learned that as my life has continued to change, post-pandemic, postpartum, being a parent, so my availability has changed. My interests have changed. My ability to commit to certain amounts of time and energy is constantly in flux. So the way in which I used to run this business, the way in which I used to run live launches and sell my courses and be online almost 24/7 during certain periods of the year in order to meet certain sales targets, that's no longer realistic for me. I can't do that. So my business model had to adapt accordingly. I've had to create a new approach to how I lead in this industry, how I teach this material, so that it's a reflection of my current capacity. Because without me, there is nothing.
And so working in this wellness space, how has that, I have here as a question for you, dealing with the more difficult detours at Yoga Detour. I don't mean to label this as difficult, but as life has evolved and you have had different responsibilities and new responsibilities, you've also moved across the country. That is a detour, difficult or not. How have you worked to maintain your own wellness in this process? Because I hear what you're saying around boundaries, right? Sounds to me that one of the main methodologies by which you have been able to pivot effectively and understand that I need to take care of myself, because if I don't exist, my brand doesn't exist, because that's the nature of the work that I do. Some of those boundaries involve, we're looking for tangible takeaways here, Cess. Some of those boundaries have been in availability. So time, I'm not able to give as much time, maybe my launches of courses. How else have you restricted or created protection around what you're doing in terms of some of these capital costs for your business now, given some of the natural detours you've had to experience in recent years? How are you taking care of yourself in that process?
A lot of that has come down to managing our expenses, because I found that was a major source of stress for me. It was on my shoulders. And for a long time, I found that all of the work that I was doing, all of the ideas I was bringing to life, it felt like I was doing that in servitude of debt. Mm-hmm. Debt that we took on during the pandemic through government loans, debt that I had to our contractors who were taking pay cuts and we weren't able to keep their rates the same and still stay afloat. So it felt like I was the one responsible for doing all this work to pay everyone else except for myself.
Mhm.
And so in order to get out of that vicious cycle, I had to really take a cold, hard look at where we were spending money and how I could cut those costs in a way that wasn't going to be detrimental to the business as a whole, but might mean that we just have fewer of the nice to haves along the way. So trimming, getting things down to what was truly necessary to run this business and a, financially responsible, we'll say, way.
Yeah,
Not that we weren't financially responsible before, but there was a time where things just looked a lot different, and the
exactly.
pandemic changed that.
Yeah.
So once I was aware that the changes incurred by the pandemic, such as people's diminished willingness to be online learning, the way that we didn't have that previous fatigue prior to COVID. So once I saw that that fatigue wasn't going away, that our business model was going to have to change, that we weren't going to bring in money the same way we did before, our spending had to change accordingly. And now we're in a place where things are far more balanced. Things are far more, I think they're healthier as far as what I am responsible for producing versus what I was responsible for producing before.
And, I think the lesson, this tangible takeaway of reducing overhead and balancing budgets and ins and outs. And, there's so many tangible takeaways this week. I got to mention this one too later. It's life. Like, and this is what we're both entrepreneurs. And so often when people talk to us about entrepreneurialism, I find I'm talking about strategies that I employ in my own management of my own life. That you have to, how responsible are you for, what are you responsible for? How are you carrying those responsibilities? And when it comes to ins and outs, that circumstances change. And what I used to have, like I used to live off $24,000 a year. I had a roommate, I had cheap rent, I still bought organic food because that was a deal breaker for me. I still spent money on organic food. I was living a good life, Seth. And then circumstances, there were things I just couldn't afford. And then, circumstances change and your expenditures can change. But I find one of the hardest ones for people, and a lot of people felt this during the pandemic and are still, given the economic trials and tribulations that are going on in the world. It's hard when you're used to a certain standard of expenditure, right? Like your business was thriving, or I had a stable job, and you were used to a certain amount of coming in. And so your expenses, like your mortgage, your kid's school, right? Like there are expenses now that are assigned to that level of income, that when I have to change and I have to take away and reduce, often, obviously that can result in some real logistical nightmares. But let's just address the kind of mindset and fear related obstacles to that kind of a shift, because you're a very practical person. You would have crunched the numbers. You would have said this isn't sustainable. You would have also been self-aware enough to say, I'm not living my best life here. I don't feel great. But you still would have had to deal with that kind of mindset of like, this isn't a failure, right? This is just life. And it's super scary to take things away, not knowing if things are going to come back. How did you deal with that kind of mindset and fear related elements of this type of practical adaptability and pivot, as you call it?
Well, I think it was sort of two phases. One was acknowledging that for a time, my priority had to be fueling a cash injection into the company. And what that meant was putting my head down and doing the work to sell. And so for about 6 to 8 months, 6 months, I was producing online workshops where every month there was a new workshop that people were purchasing a la carte for a very reasonable price. We're talking, it was like probably in the realm of $37 to $47 a pop. And I was leveraging volume versus the individual value of each sale. So by getting 50, 60, 100 sales per workshop, I was managing our monthly expenses that way. And it was those workshops that helped us get out of the hole that we were in. And well, not that we were in a hole, we would have been in a hole had I not started teaching those workshops. And those workshops are what kept the company alive with cash flow flowing. But I also knew when I was in that it had to be temporary, because I was on this hamster wheel of effort where every month it was like I would figure out an idea of what to teach this workshop. I would build this curriculum around this workshop. I would then write my emails, I'd make my Instagram posts. I would teach this workshop. I would put all of the on what's it called? Systems in place so that people were getting the right emails at the right time from their purchase and all of that stuff. I was doing everything myself, and it would leave me exhausted. So that I would go back underground for 2 weeks before I had to start all over again.
Right.
So it did not feel sustainable. And like you're saying, I knew that I was not living my best life. But in that time, that was what was necessary to make ends meet. And I think I had to go through that to prove to myself that A, I can still do this. I still have value to share. B, there are people in my community who want to continue to learn from me, and they will continue to pay for that. And those were two really important things for me to be reminded of. And then the third thing that it taught me was this is not what I want to keep doing forever. I cannot work with this model forever. Yes, I have value to provide. Yes, I have people willing to pay for that. But this way of doing it is not sustainable.
That's just part one of this exciting conversation, my friends. Click on part two and continue with us on this important journey we like to call the education revolution.